zoning and housing affordability. So for kind of all of those reasons, it seems like a perfect time to have this conversation. And we're very lucky to have Art both on the Planning Commission and on the subcommittee because he is very knowledgeable about the financial aspect of affordable housing. So as you saw from what Lynn sent out, Art has put together a presentation tonight. So we're going to start with Art talking through his presentation, which will give us an overview of affordable housing and what we've done in New Canaan so far. And then once that's finished, and then we'll parlay that into hopefully a short conversation about the proposed legislation at the state level. But I think we'd be remiss to not talk about that if we want to. And then I want to end with a conversation about the other tools we have available to us and where we want to head next in terms of affordable housing. So it's a lot to fit into our 45 minutes, but hopefully we'll get through as much as we can. And if not, we'll continue the next time. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Art, and I think Lynn has your presentation.
Thanks, Krista.
Give me a second.
Yep. Is everybody
You
okay?
can start talking.
Yeah, is everybody okay on volume? I want to make sure I'm not speaking too loudly or too softly. So great. So the purpose of this summary was simply to provide the view of affordable housing as if you're not from New Canaan and you don't have a perspective about what the policy takeaway should be. So what I just tried to do was create a couple of slides, and we can just click right to the first one. The genesis of the issue is particularly associated with racial and social justice issues and rising house prices. And the most important point, which I didn't put in here, is that rising rents have made affordability extremely high. That's generally not a suburban topic. It is absolutely an urban topic, but we are surrounded by urban spaces. And so what I wanted to do today, and you see this in the second bullet, is talk about similar topics and what is income related and what is generally race-based related or protected class. Second is to create awareness of some approaches and terms that all of us will deal with and identify those key terms and topics. And then to talk about some of the achievements that we have actually done in our town, which are not particularly well known, but actually in the context of other communities are very important. These topics obviously have political, social, legal, and economic considerations, and there are many people who are, in fact, more expert at particular subtopics than I am. But all of our departments, particularly housing and finance, are affected by the policies that are adopted by us. And my basic point in the end is to make sure that we engage a broader community discussion about the challenges, the opportunities, and the evolutions of what we propose to do as a town. Thanks, Lynn. Could you cut to the next?
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. And then the key phrase here called affordable housing is a catch-all term, but it has a bunch of problems. A homeowner looking to rent an apartment defines affordable housing very differently when looking at a federal or a state usage. The internet effect, which I talk about in the second bullet, is huge because it is extremely easy to get ubiquitous and apparently expert demographic information. So, after this meeting, not tonight, I would actually recommend that people consider going to the easily available public website, which is called the ffiec.gov. That is a website which is used quite frequently, particularly by community groups and advocates, to build, I'll call it a stalking horse, about what a community does or does not do. And as a group, we should become familiar with the data, not because we necessarily believe that it is determinative, but because it is one lens that's used to look at how New Canaan exists. There is a particular challenge that comes with that, because if you take a glancing blow look at demographic data, housing prices, and income data, you'll find such stark contrast between New Canaan and surrounding communities and the general community that we need to be careful. The third bullet here is particularly important, and if I only leave one thought with people tonight, is that there are many regulations and laws that affect rental, sales, and building of housing. And concepts of income, race, and age are frequently linked in discussion, but they're independent in the terms of setting affordable housing strategy. And some of those linked topics, and I can gladly answer questions on any of these, are, for example, the Fair Housing Act, the Community Reinvestment Act, which applies to banks, Connecticut 830G, which is state regulation, the low-income housing tax credit, which is derived from the Department of Treasury and taxation policy, and then the concepts of Section 8 policy. A notable point about each of those is that all 5 of them deal with income, all 5 of them deal with race, and all 5 of them are governed by different laws, different agencies, and different regulations. If we were to draw a great big Venn diagram, many of them would intersect, a set of them conflict, and all of them are applicable to New Canaan. So going to the demographics point, a couple of sort of basic concepts for the town of New Canaan. New Canaan has 4 what are known as census tracts, TRACTS. Those census tracts, data and demographic information are readily available, literally by going back to that ffiec.gov website. Interestingly, if you go to that website and you punch in any address in town, except one that may be in a really rural district and isn't what's called geocoded, you can determine what census tract it is in, and you can determine the racial, ethnic, and income demographics of that community. It is extremely possible to do what's called inverse data calculations. So if somebody wants to, for example, guess your household income, with a couple of clicks, you can rapidly determine for any address what the current assessed value is of a house in town, what the likely income would be needed to buy that house using standard mortgage terms, and quickly validate through Zillow, for example, what that housing price is. So this data are currently available through 2020. And I'm sure that Lynn will probably raise later the fact that we're in an interesting point about when the 2020 census data are officially available, but there is something called the American Communities Survey, ACS, which is updated each year, and it's an extremely reliable data point which provides updated annual income and demographic data. So if you are a community activist or somebody looking to figure out what's going on in New Canaan, you might quickly say, well, what is Connecticut median family income? So the whole state of Connecticut for year 2019 was $78,000. Our metropolitan area, which includes Stamford, Norwalk, and Bridgeport, that number is $119,000. The west side of New Canaan census tract has a median family income of $282,000, which is 2.3 times the metropolitan value and 3.6 times the state average. Again, these are quick clicks, but they're highly reliable. The east and west side census tracts, west side of New Canaan is the most affluent in terms of income characteristics, but they're quite similar for the east side census tract in the west. And census tracts are generally done by sort of categories of population. But what's important here are the last 2 bullets. The first is the number of household units, the minority population, the number of homes and renters, and similar data are easily available and easily comparable to state, national, and regional data. MFI, and that's a term, median family income, is the relevant income which is used for measure of whether housing is affordable, and it's all frequently used to determine eligibility for things like the low income housing tax credit. Now, you guys, one of the concepts that becomes really important is how to build or develop additional affordable housing. The terms that I've sort of glossed over here are very important because they are the rules and language of a sort of subgenre of the world that says, oh my God, what happens here? Is a town affordable? For example, you would rapidly say if the median household price in the 4 census tracts of New Canaan is, I don't know what the number is, but sales price last year, probably $850,000. One would rapidly say, okay, if interest rates are generically at 4.5% or 5%, and somebody requires a 10% down payment, then the required income to back into that would be a household income probably of $175,000 to $177,000. So the affordability calculation gets done in that approach by people who are interested in affordable housing. On the flip side, in a positive way, that sort of information is used to help create tools that become available for building and supporting affordable housing, such as the low-income housing tax credit. Lynn, could you flip to the next slide?
Yep, sorry.
So thank you. And so one of the things that, and again, I'll be glad to answer any questions about these things, but if you look at affordable housing achievements in New Canaan, we underestimate, I think, sometimes the significant things that have been done in our town. And the last bullet will hit some of the specific examples. We have made some significant strides towards getting high quality affordable housing. And the evidence of that is that our performance against 830G is decent. And our current moratorium was earned because we had enough of something called housing equivalent unit, HEUs. However, as we go to apply for another moratorium or a second moratorium, it is really important that we recognize that although the 2020 census data may not have been published yet, when it is officially published, and you could find it by going to the American survey now, the ACS survey, you would find that there are more units in the denominator. So the rough rule of thumb that 830G drives for is that 10% of a community's units be considered affordable. The key feature is that they be affordable on a regional basis, not necessarily on a town of New Canaan basis. So the second bullet, which is that says that as an example, each new home or apartment built in town increases the denominator of total units. That becomes very important because in order to meet the 10% guidelines that Lynn, for example, has to look at in her capacity, we have to have a constant measure of both the numerator, which is the number of technically affordable units, and the denominator, which is eligible housing units in a community. The third bullet, we have a unique tool, and it is relatively unique in Connecticut, in fact, in the region. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which exists in town, is a great advantage. It has been used extensively to support and supplement the projects that I'll talk about in the minute below. We also have the New Canaan Housing Authority. It is an independent entity, and it has overseen the creation and rehabilitation of new units of housing. I'll tell a quick anecdotal story which will make everybody feel good, but also at the same time give you a little bit of cause concern. About 2 years ago, I was in Hartford at an affordable housing event at the State House. And it was for the housing authorities in the state. And there are 171 communities or 173 communities in town. There actually are roughly 45 housing authorities. But what has happened over the last 30 years is that very few of the housing authorities have actually built new affordable housing. Most of them have been in the business of maintaining existing affordable housing. The good news is that we in New Canaan, through our housing authority, have actually built and deployed new housing in the last decade. But for many years, the housing authorities throughout the state, with notable exceptions like Stamford and Darien, and to a degree Westport, have not built a lot of new housing. There has been a lot of new housing in Hartford. There has been a lot of new housing in Meriden, and there's been new housing on the Eastern Shore communities. But a lot of communities have allowed their housing authorities, to the extent that they have them, to become maintenance agents, which has had the effect of not causing significant net new construction. The awareness and tracking of housing performance and goals is critical. And there are really two measures that I believe are critically important in defining our strategies. The first is, how are we doing with respect to 830G? And we frankly need to be tracking that each month, every time we have a building permit go out, so that we're never caught up later on with saying, oh my gosh, the net creation of units has been high and we haven't added enough affordable units. And we need to be constantly tracking and assessing where we are with respect to the next moratorium application. Sort of as a layman's brief on this, what happens is that if you have built affordable housing, you can get a moratorium that prevents 830G from being applied in your community if you can demonstrate that you're on track to getting to the 10%. So as Lynn knows and referred to earlier, we currently have a moratorium, and we're going to apply presumably soon for an extension and perhaps a second or a third. But it's a constantly moving target because the numerator grows each time you add a unit of defined affordable housing on the top of the calculation, and an eligible baseline in the denominator. On the upside, we have built and upgraded a bunch of affordable housing recently. And I put them in the order of the recent creations. This isn't to list all of the affordable housing in town, but it is for those of you who travel over towards the 123 area and you look at what's going on. First, there was the New Canaan Mill project, which basically did not add units, but significantly upgraded existing units. Then there was Millport Phase 1 and Millport Phase 2, both of which added significant units. And the current construction right over there on Route 123 is Canaan Parish. All four of those projects were done with what are called 4% low-income housing tax credits. In the case of Canaan Parish, it took old dilapidated housing that had approximately 50 units, and it's going to add a net additional 50 units. So that, for example, the last time Lynn had to oversee, or someone had to oversee, a moratorium application, we were able to take units, for example, from Millport's Phase 1 and 2 and add them up and look at the base and be able to say that we were doing okay. Canaan Parish, similarly, when it is completed, will add units. There's a set of challenges, though, that people should be aware of. For example, the definitions of affordability are quite defined and totally non-variable. Either somebody qualifies or they don't. And separately, if someone actually lives in affordable housing and they are a good tenant and don't violate any rule, even if their income grows, they are generally allowed to remain in that housing. Consequently, you can end up with what's commonly known in the industry as a gap against goal. And the challenge is, you might have tenants, for example, who are aging in place, or in fact have stayed, or perhaps have gone back to college and gotten a better job, but they may still be income eligible. But the problem is creation and unit filling. Everybody should be aware that affordable housing lease up and affordable housing maintenance and annual certification are terms that would get you to be glassy-eyed, but they are really important to do effective management of your affordable housing stock. For example, someone who applies to live in affordable housing has to provide a certification in an application that shows their eligibility, including documents like tax returns. And they need to certify on an annual basis with reporting and documentation what's going on. Typically, those things are done by third-party certifying entities to make sure that they are correct. That's an important part of the process. Lynn, could you flip? Thank you. I know that we've talked a little bit more about, what is an affordable housing. The construction, management, ownership, tenancy, and operation are very similar to a traditional housing project, except all of the numbers are different. And the most critical distinction is in the second bullet point, which is that tenancy is limited to a specific population and it is often, but not always, subsidized as a matter of public policy. Subsidies can come in a variety of forms, including what are, people use the phrase Section 8 housing. In Section 8 housing, interestingly, the landlord gets to collect a market rate rent, collects no more than 25% of a tenant's income, and the balance can be subsidized under a voucher program from the federal government. One of the interesting things when you talk about the amount of money we get or don't get from Washington or from Hartford is that tenancy subsidies, for example, are frequently not calculated because they're hard to know, but they are substantial subsidies that go back to communities. The levels on the third bullet, the levels and form of subsidy vary, and they include rental support, capital in the form of federal and state tax credits, low interest rate loans from state agencies, and we have a bunch of them here in New Canaan, and tax abatements from municipalities. Interestingly, in some communities, tax abatements are frequently done for affordable housing. In some communities, they're never done. The theory is, why should they in fact be abated at all? That becomes a matter frequently of town taxation policy. New Canaan has been at the forefront of using these tools to build and rehabilitate housing, but target renter populations, and if you were going to put a yellow highlight on one thing here, they include low-income families, they include seniors, they include vets, they include people with disabilities. There are many categories of people, and the only major federal tool which is at the disposal of a community is the low-income housing tax credit. And that tax credit has not grown in value over the years, with the exception of a minor technical fix last year. Used to be, the credit itself is figured out as a percentage of the total eligible development cost. But what has happened in many cases, especially during the last decade, is there hasn't been a lot of support for increased resources for affordable housing. Consequently, what has happened is that, whatever money you have goes to senior housing and low-income housing, and in another term, which is workforce housing, which is not technically eligible. People frequently say, well, I'd like to build affordable housing so our school teachers, police officers, and municipal employees can live here. Frequently, those folks, we would love to have them live here, but they will not qualify necessarily as eligible under the rules using tax credits. And those rules are absolutely strictly enforced. That's honestly the last bullet. All tenants must meet eligibility and annual cert criteria, and compliance with tax law and housing law is actively enforced. The failure to comply properly creates big challenges for both the owner and developer of the property, but also a sponsoring municipality if you're the Housing Authority of New Canaan. Thank you, Lynn. Canaan Parish, great example. What happened there? Right, you guys, if you drive by there right now, you see an incredible amount of construction going on. It's an example of a 4% low-income housing tax credit affordable housing project. The total project cost is approximately $45 million. When it's completed, it will have 100 units of brand new housing, but only 40 of those units will be new. There were 60 before. Actually, adding 40 to old structure was 60. There are 40 new, and there were 60 there before, I think. It might be 60 or 40, I'm sorry. The unit cost is $450,000 per unit. And by the way, that's important because there was virtually no land cost here, because this was built on what used to be an old HUD project with a very low or limited basis. The Housing Authority in New Canaan is the developer and sponsor, and will earn out a developer fee of about $2.8 million in the completion of this project. That money will go back to the Housing Authority. So how is it built? What goes into that? The first thing is the purchase of the low-income housing tax credits. And again, as I guess a mea culpa, right? I happened to purchase those low-income housing tax credits as part of what I do for a living for People's United Bank. But we purchased those credits. It was a directly placed deal. It did not go through a syndicator. So it saved the costs of syndication, which are roughly 5 to 6%. And there's an active business out there, and we just were able to do that because we were. There is an FHA first mortgage of $30 million. It is 40-year amortizing debt. It was debt that, by the way, banks can't do. Originally, this deal was going to be structured with Bankwell buying the tax-exempt debt, which was what was done at Millport's Phase 1 and Phase 2. But in this particular case, there was a better deal available with longer amortization and lower rates. So it was privately placed through Rockport Mortgage. There's a second mortgage from the sponsor, in this case, New Canaan Housing Authority. Eversource provided rebates of $208,000, and there are several other sources that are embedded in there. Short-term construction debt was provided by Bankwell in this particular case. So the way the project structuring will work is that there was an existing structure. The first units are going to be built. The money is coming from Bankwell initially. 10% of the People's United direct investment has already gone in, $1.1 million. But the way one of these transactions typically works is the low-income housing tax credits can't flow in until something called an 8609 is issued. That's an IRS form that certifies that the project was completed. It has to be certified by an architect that it's met the design and characteristics associated with the project. But more important than all of that is it has to be completed and occupiable, though it can be occupied in stages. In this particular case, the existing tenants are going from the old building into the new buildings when the new buildings are ready, and then the second phase will be built. It's a several-year development process with a phase-in of capital and residency during the process. There are significantly more tenants who are on the waiting list to live there than units will ultimately exist, remembering that the net creation, I think, was 44 new units. The current tenants will be moved to the new units. Units range from 755 square feet to 1,455 square feet. Why that's important is in order to meet low-income housing tax credit eligibility, units have to have certain characteristics, including measurement sizes. It's not, it is not cheaper, and this is probably an important point. In the third bullet, you see the unit cost of $450,000 per unit. You're correct if you say, well, how much could I build market rate housing for? Interestingly, building affordable housing is no less expensive than building market rate housing, with the sole notion that you won't necessarily have the same level of amenities and fix up, but you will definitely have the same wiring, plumbing, infrastructure, and other costs. There are significant advantages in all 4 of the New Canaan projects that we've talked about today. All of them are on existing water and sewer lines. All of them had low costs of property. That's okay. You probably flip right on, Lynn. And then final issue. The current inventory of proposals at Hartford, I decided that rather than list them all, I just say, when I look at these, what do you see? I see 4 topics. One, you see taxation issues and property tax control issues. The second topic, of course, is local control and zoning. There's a lot of movement to try to remove local zoning capacity and, in fact, the right to manage your own policies. There are technical adjustments with respect to 830G and 830J, which is a separate rule. 830G is the one that has the biggest impact from sort of my view, because it affects how a developer could come into town and say, if you don't let me build something, then I will build, massive affordable housing is the general concern. State funding and development is a 5th topic, and rent control and similar topics are discussed up in Hartford, and there's proposed legislation on all of the above. Again, and I thank the committee for listening to this. I'll be glad to field any questions. But what I was really hoping to do was sort of, if you only looked at the bullets at the top of the pages, was provide a sort of factual context for topics that are discussed, frankly, in every community in the Northeast, certainly. the sort of rules that we have in Connecticut, the 830G rules, exist in New York, they exist in New Jersey, they exist in Massachusetts, and they exist in Connecticut. But there are forms of regulation in virtually every state. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Art. That was very informative. Does anyone have questions? We do have a lot to pack in tonight, but I do want to give everyone a chance since that was a lot of information.
Well, one quick question. Is there a difference between the term affordable housing and low income housing?
Yes.
Are they?
A great question, Dick. They are frequently interchanged. And the key thing that we need to be careful of is that if we wish to meet guidelines for state purposes, we need to be in the affordable housing definition. And it is a quite precise definition based, for example, on either an individual or a household income set in context of the area median income. So for example, there's a term called LHI, which is extra low housing income. So that means for somebody to be in the LHI category, their median family income, including everybody who lives in the unit, has to be less than 25% of the area median. So in this case, area median is 119, give or take change. Somebody's income to be eligible in the LHI category would have to be less than $25,000. Now that's entirely possible for a senior, right, who might be a retiree to be in that category. However, right, it is entirely possible that you could have a couple with two working couples, or I'm sorry, a working couple, married or unmarried or otherwise, who both live in the same roof with two children. They would be in the median family categorization, and they could be moderate income and eligible to live in that property. Moderate would let them come up to 80% of area median, which in this case would be 80% of $119,000. So the array of income levels that could potentially live in affordable housing is broad, depending on family size, number of permanent residents, and the area median income.
A couple issues here. A lot of this seems to come down to money, and I think I'm going to speak on my behalf, and I think it reflects much of the commission that the Planning and Zoning Commission of New Canaan would like to remain in control of planning and zoning in the town of New Canaan. And how do you do that with 830G potentially having a significant effect? If you look across the border in Wilton, which lost its 830G exemption, significant changes were made there as far as housing activity and building and so forth, pretty substantial. So it again comes down to cash and often and directly or indirectly. And so there are some things this commission may want to consider. One is it'd have to be a recommendation to the town council, which would be the legislative body. If you pull a building permit, $10 essentially fee or tax, use your favorite term, is assessed and goes to the housing authority for affordable housing. And it's based on the cost of the build. Should that be reviewed? Which would provide more money to the housing authorities. They can build more housing and maintain our 830G exemption. The second is whether the Planning and Zoning Commission should be able to require builders to include affordable housing in a build. They do this, I believe, in Darien, where if my numbers are right, it's anything over 10 units, they can require 12%. I'm not sure how they do that partial housing unit, but anyway, you can pick your percentages, but we could require that. So for example, if the View or Merit Apartments were to appear again or something even smaller, we could say, okay, X% of these units have to be affordable. Long discussion on what that term means. That is something also that might be considered, because every time a new unit appears in this town, you're running hard to stay in place to maintain your eligibility for 830G exemption. And so this could be a way to do that. And that's something we may wish to consider.
So I'll just comment, if I could, on what John just said. Many communities actually require, for example, a set aside, and Stamford is a good example. And typically that is a 10%. Interestingly, in Stamford, you don't necessarily have to put your affordable units in the same building. So Stamford will allow a developer upon application to identify replacement units that can be built elsewhere, but they are attached with a land use restriction document, so that what you end up with is that if you want to build, for example, on extremely expensive land, call it on the seashore, I can't think of a better phrase, the developer can submit a plan and provide permanent units in another part of town. In New York City, they frequently do what are called 80/20s. I did a lot of those in my days when I was in New York City affordable housing. 80/20s are literally the city requires 20% of the units in a building to be affordable. And in exchange for that, they get higher density exchange rates, so that, you know, for example, a New York City developer actually likes that proposition, because if they could only build, you know, 62 units, they get to build 68, and he'll end up with not 68 total units, but, you know, 74 units or whatever it is. And in exchange for that, 20% of the units have a LURA. Many communities do require, again, and this is where you'd have to get to an attorney to draft appropriate language, but many communities require, as of right, the notion that if you apply for 10 or more units, or even 7 or more in many places, that there be an appropriate build out which is locked in, not necessarily in the same building, which can be a feature that could work. But again, thank you, John.
Sure.
Art, hi. Thank you for putting this together. I appreciate it. So HUD and I think the Department of Justice are looking at whether Connecticut has violated fair housing, some portions of the Fair Housing Act, I think related to where Section 8 vouchers could be used, and accessibility to affordable housing. So away from what's going to happen on the state side, because the legislative piece is such a wild card and largely out of our control, going to the federal side, having to do with the Fair Housing Act and what might be being looked at in this court case, to the extent you're aware of it, are there things that are especially pertinent to us in New Canaan in keeping in accordance with Fair Housing Act laws? And then just a second part of that is, what do you think is the likelihood that whenever this court case is determined, the laws are going to be really supersede whatever the legislature may or may not do this session?
So James, those are great questions, and I'll sort of give you a couple of answers. One, that's why at the beginning of my presentation, I wanted to distinguish concepts of affordable housing from Fair Housing Act enforcement. They are very closely linked, and I can't tell you whether or not, and most fair housing issues are driven by groups like, there are a couple up in Hartford that are very good. They tend to focus, by the way, on rental challenges more than sale challenges. And real estate agents, as you guys may have seen the example last year in Long Island of challenges to fair housing, and in fact zoning rules as a result of those challenges. I can't tell you when fair housing will become a massive issue, but that was actually why I led with the demographics review. I would strongly encourage people to look at the FFIEC data and the race-based demographic distribution embedded in that, because it's a place where you could start to look and say, okay, according to the demographic information, if you take New Canaan as a whole, it's very affluent and it is very white, and consequently somebody might start there, but I don't know. But fair housing is a very different discipline from affordable housing. And, obviously the Venn diagram of intersection is really big.
All right. I don't want to cut us off because this is a great conversation, but unfortunately we have our next meeting coming up at 7. So we do need to wrap up to leave enough time for Lynn to get people in the waiting room for the 7 p.m. Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. I had some slides. I'm going to skip those, but I'll just kind of move ahead to where I want to take us in the next meeting. So on the Planning Commission's website, Lynn has some old studies that have been done, and one of them was done in 2011 by Planometrics, and Lynn and I can send this out after the meeting, but it is currently available on our website. And it was a housing opportunity strategy that was done, I think, in reaction to legislation at the state level that is called 813, which allows municipalities to create what are called incentive housing zones. And it basically examines whether New Canaan should consider doing this. Now, an incentive housing zone is similar to what both John, Chris, and Art were talking about in terms of inclusionary zoning, except it is a very prescriptive program that the state put together. You have to follow, exactly their rules for affordability, for density bonuses, for process, and if you do, then you become eligible for some funding from the state for pre-development and planning costs associated with the affordable housing that you're creating. At that time in 2011, when this study was done, the recommendation, and I'm assuming they worked with the Planning Commission and possibly the community to come up with this, was that the town did not want to pursue an incentive housing zone. But the alternative that's recommended in this study is that we do look at what we're calling inclusionary housing, which is what John and Art were talking about, where a certain percentage of units in new developments are set aside as affordable with some sort of deed restriction in exchange for density bonuses, coverage bonuses, height bonuses, other things that make it financially feasible for the developer to provide that affordable housing. So what I'm gonna ask you guys to do for the next meeting, and I'm hoping the next meeting will be in March, is take a look at this study, and there's actually draft language in here for an inclusionary housing zone that proposes an overlay zone. It doesn't replace any underlying zoning districts, and it does have some numbers in there in terms of how many, what percent of units we'd be looking for, that type of thing. I've looked at that. I've looked at what Greenwich, Stamford, Darien, Westport, the surrounding towns are doing, and most of them do have a version of an inclusionary zoning. So I've been working, on my own thoughts on how to take what was done in 2011 and bring it forward in 2021. And that's kind of where I want to head with this, is a conversation about, can we do that? Should we do that? What would that look like? And so that's where I want to take us. But I think, in terms of getting to there, looking at this study and seeing what was done in 2011 will give you a good baseline for where we can go in the future. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve. And I'm hoping that we can meet again in March to continue this conversation and maybe talk more specifically about what an inclusionary zoning district would look like in New Canaan. Any thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, then we'll
Good, thank you.
call this meeting closed, and Lynn, you can prepare us for the next one.
I'm just going to step
Okay.
away for 2 minutes. I've been burning, so I'll be right back. Thank you.
Step away too, but before I forget, James, can you unmute?
Yep.
So you and I have met, but how do I pronounce your last name?
Oh, it's very easy. Bash.
Bash. Okay.
I'd love to say it was
That, one of the things I'm really good at in this commission, Dick Ward's laughing, is I butcher names.
I'd love to say it was more fancy like Bosch, but it's actually unfortunately like Bash. It's just Bash.
You're not an heir to the German auto parts.
No, not at all. No.